My name is Chris Doyle. I'm the director of Caabu, so I will just be hosting today's event. It's our 5th public webinar at Caabu, and all of these are available as recordings on our website, as this one will be as well, as long as the technology works. And if you want to learn more about our events, then please do let us know. You can join our events mailing list, and even better, it would be great if you can join Caabu as well. We'll let you know about membership subscription details on the chat, which is also where you will see questions. And if you wish to submit any questions to our speakers today, that's great. So we turn our minds to Libya. It's our 2nd meeting on Libya so far this year. We had Peter Millett, the former British ambassador to Libya, briefing to parliamentarians and others in Parliament back in February. There's a recording of that on our website. We'll share that link. And it's an appropriate moment. It's just over a year since Khalifa Haftar launched his offensive on Tripoli, so we can take stock, the consequences of that offensive in terms of loss of life, destruction, displacement of people. And we have seen all too sadly the fighting continuing, the shelling of civilian targets. And now on top of that, the great fear of the pandemic. There's been 51 cases, I think I'm right in saying, in Libya so far of COVID-19. So we can discuss all of this, the role of the international community, the regional actors in Libya, mercenaries, the flouting of the arms embargo, and how to hold warring parties to account. You know, what might be the prospects to go forward. And we have 3 great speakers. You've all seen their biographies. Elham Saudi, who's the co-founder and director for Lawyers for Justice in Libya. Anas Gomati, he's the founder and director general of the Tripoli-based Sadeq Institute, which is the first public, independent public policy think tank in Libya, established back in August of 2011. And Tarek Maghasi, who is a policy fellow with the North Africa and Middle East program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. All of them are supremely expert to be able to enlighten us today. We're going to start off with Anas, and everyone is on the record. They'll speak for 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you very much, Anas. If we could start off with you, how do you see things at the moment? What are the prospects for Libya?
Thank you very much, Chris, and just thank you to Caabu for organising this, and it's a real pleasure. There's a lot to kind of cover and a lot to kind of cram in, so it's really difficult to know where to begin, but we're, as you've said earlier on, we're a year into the offensive now, just over a year, that began on April 4th, 2019. If we bring ourselves back and try to understand what was in the lead up to April 4th, there was a UN-backed political and social process. There was supposed to be a conference, the Reconciliation Conference, National Reconciliation Conference, that was set to take place 10 days before Haftar's offensive was launched on April 4th. The UN chief, Antonio Guterres, arrived to Tripoli, and as we all remember, Khalifa Haftar had to launch an offensive on that day. And much has changed since that day, and much has remained the same. Khalifa Haftar's troops and forces, which are an amalgamation of various militia, armed groups, tribal groups, and Salafi groups that he labels the Libyan Arab Armed Forces or the Libyan National Army. Those groups were divided between 2 front lines. Front line that began in the western mountain city of Gharian, which was the staging ground for the offensive, and the main principal supply line into the fighting in Tripoli, which he lost 2 months afterwards. And then the second supply line, the second front lines, which began around the town of Tarhuna and then into southeast Tripoli. And he's lost, or is in the danger now, of losing that front line. But in between this year, April 4th, 2019, and now April 2020, much has also changed. There was a political process that was gaffed. In my opinion, it began around January 8th, when Russia and Turkey announced the joint intervention, or joint peace process in Moscow, which really sparked a lot of life into an alternative process that had begun months before, called the Berlin process. But January 8th failed. It failed because they brought together one right backer of the GNA, the Government of National Accord in Tripoli, Turkey, and they brought one of the backers of Haftar, Russia, but not the principal backer, which is the UAE. Now, when they brought those two parties together, the GNA and the LNA, so Khalifa Haftar and Fayez Sarraj, the Prime Minister of the GNA, to Moscow, they both asked them simple questions. We want you to agree to a ceasefire agreement. We also want you to agree to a political process that would begin after this. But it was to be comprehensive, and it was to be agreed by the backers and by the principal actors on the ground. Fayez Sarraj signed the deal and actually left the conference proceedings in Moscow and flew to Istanbul and then on to Tripoli. And Khalifa Haftar said, I need more time. And I think the ominous words now that have haunted both political processes after this period, and left after being denied an audience with Vladimir Putin, who until this day he's never met in person. So having left Moscow without a deal, the German Foreign Ministry and German Presidency Chancellor began their own process and rushed through 12 days later to herald the Berlin process, which failed even worse, I think, in a much more catastrophic way, because it denied to see the very truth before their own eyes. And number one, the UAE, which has been the principal backer of Haftar, refused to stop violating the arms embargo. That's been the principal challenge. And in fact, during the proceedings in Berlin on January 20th, they continued to violate the arms embargo and were shipping weapons and ammunition into Benghazi, and have continued to do so throughout the month that followed the Berlin process, despite there being a UN Security Council meeting to bring around an arms embargo, one that we already have since UN Resolution 1973 that was passed in 2011. So we have the legislation. We've had two forms of legislation that have neither worked, but the political will isn't there. On Khalifa Haftar's side, what was there on April 4th hasn't changed since April 4th, 2019, and it hasn't changed today in April 2020, which is that he's been able to violate the ceasefire agreement. He's been able to violate a truce. I should also caveat that by saying the GNA have also violated the truce in Tripoli, but they have also committed to that truce. They also committed to a ceasefire. And I think even their backer, Turkey, has committed to the ceasefire in Russia. And so I think they have a vested interest in stopping the offensive. Khalifa Haftar doesn't. He still believes that he can achieve a lot more through violence. And I think that's been growing ever weaker since January. So there was a continuation of the arms embargo violations. There was a continuation of the conflict in Tripoli. And then there was the beginning of a political process that was announced after Berlin called the Geneva Talks. Now, the Geneva Talks, to put it in a very simple sense, were supposed to be the unification of institutions, parallel institutions that had been divided since the civil war that Khalifa Haftar sparked in 2014, May 15, 2014, when he announced Operation Dignity. And we had two parallel governments, two parallel parliaments, two parallel national oil corporations, central banks. And since that day, there has been great effort to reunify and reconcile those two parallel institutions. But it's critical for Haftar in the sense that today he enjoys no international legitimacy, no domestic political legitimacy, despite being appointed by the House of Representatives, the elected parliament in 2014. That elected parliament was shrouded in its own controversy when it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Tripoli in October 2014. So there has been this crisis of legitimacy domestically and a crisis of international legitimacy internationally, and a crisis from the international community in how to solve the issues at hand. But what they've led to, and I think regretfully, is a political process that without an arms embargo violation and without the mechanisms to sanction, condemn, or even criticize the principal actors, the principal protagonist in this, Khalifa Haftar, who has sparked two of Libya's three last civil wars. Without being able to sanction him or condemn him, you can't condemn anybody. And so in that sense, you can never stop the violence. And it's actually transformed a lot of the violence. That's one thing that has really changed since April 4th. April 4th, 2019, most of the violence was being used to acquire territory in Tripoli or to defend territory by the GNA in Tripoli. Since the beginning of the Geneva talks, much of the violence has transformed and has become either symbolic as a demonstration of power. So a good example of this is that Khalifa Haftar has used tribal forces to cut off the oil supply in Libya since January 19th. And in the last several weeks, in fact, an official appointed by Khalifa Haftar that replaced an elected official in the town of Shwerif has cut off the water to 3 million people in Tripoli, which was a move that, despite there being lots of personal reasons for this, he is appointed by Haftar and responsible to Haftar and can be called up by Haftar and can be stopped, I think, by Haftar. And that today continues. So it's a demonstration of force and use of violence symbolically, but also directly as a political tool to apply pressure in the negotiations. And I think this is the most catastrophic of the points, because really this is now about the skills, the negotiation skills of both camps. And one camp, the GNA, has everything to lose in terms of its legitimacy in Geneva. It's going to be giving away the legitimacy of its central bank, its political legitimacy from the GNA, or the UN-backed international legitimacy, and giving a portion of that to Haftar. And so Haftar is now applying major pressure, or has been, and his backers, principally the UAE, Russia, and Egypt, that have been applying military pressure or aerial pressure using drones and F-16s over the last year to improve their negotiation position, to improve their bargaining position. But also, and I think a good example of this has been the use of airstrikes in Tripoli on residential areas, which is really there to kind of break the resolve of the UN-backed government, or to use violence towards the city of Misrata to draw away troops from the defense of Tripoli. And then finally, and I think this is the most regretful area, is that given the COVID-19 global pandemic, the systematic targeting of Libya's public health system, so the LNA's attack, or the LAAF's attack on the COVID-19 hospital in Tripoli, the Habba al-Khadra hospital, the targeting of air ambulances at the Matiga civilian airport in Tripoli. I mean, these things are designed to induce social pressure and break the resolve of the GNA during negotiations. Now that we've got a global pandemic and we can't travel and we can't meet anymore, those negotiations are certainly off for the time being. They look like they were fractured and going to break by the time that the UN Special Representative to Libya, Ghassan Salama, on March 2nd, resigned from his post, citing stress, most likely because he was never allowed the tools to really apply pressure on the principal protagonist, as I said, Khalifa Haftar, to stop his offensive and create a constructive platform for talks. So violence has been used to spoil that. Violence has been used as a tool of pressure in the political talks, but it's now spiraled out. And I think given the distraction that COVID has provided from Libya, the proceedings in Libya and the war in Libya has just spiraled out of control. And the GNA have made ground that they were unable to make in the last year since they took Gharian. The Turkish Air Force in particular and Turkish military assistance has given the GNA a competitive advantage. They began to strike the supply lines of Khalifa Haftar towards Darhuna and towards central Libya. They provided an air defense system from the shores of Tripoli and Misrata to ensure that the LNA's UAE-backed drone force, these Chinese mimics of predator drones, they're called wing loons, have lost their competitive advantage in the skies. And it's really kind of tilted. And I think the last thing was there was a military exercise by the Turkish Air Force, F-16s, that were flown over the coast of Libya, particularly to the coast of Benghazi, and a sign of the ability now for Turkey to kind of increase the pressure on Haftar. And I think this has had, regretfully, even though nobody would want to see further military escalation, it's equaled out the playing field, number one. Number two, I think it's created a ceasefire around Tripoli, and it will defend and see the humanitarian death toll go down and displacement toll go down around Tripoli. So it's stopping the offensive by hook or by crook. And it could lead to a prospect for negotiations between the two parties further down the line. And I'll make a final point on the negotiations. These negotiations, in my view, are laughable and they're hypocritical, because they start with a predefined outcome, which is that Khalifa Haftar, despite his behavior, despite countless violations of the arms embargo by his backers, despite countless abuses and war crime allegations in eastern Libya, despite any behavior, any conduct on the battlefield, Khalifa Haftar's position has never been questioned by the international community. We should remind ourselves that he is not internationally recognized. He recognizes himself and is self-appointed as the head of his own armed forces, his own army, and has continued an offensive and is being rewarded by that. So his spoiling has been rewarded, and the outcome is fairly simple. They will take a portion of the GNA's legitimacy, and they could agree to a ceasefire in the meantime. But Khalifa Haftar has walked away from ceasefires before. We should remember that the second civil war that he sparked in May 15, 2014, took a year and a half to negotiate a peace process. This tug of war that happens with conflicts, side A can't agree with side B, so you bring in side C. Side C is the UN-backed government in Tripoli. They have actually no skin in the game. There were no conflicts before with Fayez Sarraj, who is an architect from a very small suburb in Tripoli. And you know, we were told by the UN, in fact, and you can Google this and look at Reuters and hear all the comments that were made by the former UN Special Representative Bernardine Leon, who, when he left his post as the SRSG to Libya, went to go and work for the UAE's diplomatic academy, and has just continued to provide. The UN, and this is a real point that we have to stick to, the UN has given not only sanctity and sanction and safety for Haftar, but his backers, despite what they do. The last time we had this, this negotiation period for a year and a half, we were told there were no plan Bs. The only plan A that we would go forward with was the Government of National Accord. And the week after, Khalifa Haftar decided that he wasn't on board with it and that he would continue to fight. But we should also remember that his backers were building the first and only overseas airbase in Libya's short history, at least for the last 60 years, since the American airbase, Wheeler Air Base, was taken out in 1970. So the last 45 or 50 years, the first airbase that was created on Libyan soil, Al Khadim, in eastern Libya, that was being created and being constructed during the peace process. So we should remind ourselves that Haftar and his backers have been preparing for war, even though the UN were preparing for peace. And that's been going on now for 5 years. So it's a shambles that we've gotten to this point, that we've gotten to a second negotiation period that has failed. I don't know what the prospects are going forward, but if we look and continue with the UN's process, which is that you reward people despite their behavior, despite their conduct on the battlefield, despite their legitimacy and their integrity, if they walk away and devalue or break a ceasefire or break political agreements or launch offensives in the process or in the presence of the UN chief. This kind of tells you that the red lines in Libya don't exist and that there are those on the ground and in the air creating their own red lines. So my perspective is and prospects are that there's probably going to be an escalation of violence and a loss of trust, particularly from those that have either backed the UN-backed government at Tripoli or those that took up arms in 2011 that believed in UN Resolution 1973. It's going to be very difficult to bring that camp cohesively back together and ask them to either trust in the UN-backed process further down the line, 6 months down the line, or a year down the line, or it could be up to 2 years if COVID continues in the way that we're seeing, but also to kind of bring trust and get them to value a process where they believe that Khalifa Haftar might hold to his word this time. So I'm not optimistic in any stretch, and I'm neither optimistic in the fact that we don't have a fair arbiter and a fair process going forward. So not much optimism from me, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Anas. That was a terrific way to kick off this afternoon's discussions. I can't say that it was particularly uplifting, but it was a very clearly stated a position. We shall now turn to Tariq, but just before we do that, just to remind everybody that if you wish to ask a question, if you could put it in the chat, that would be great, and to keep your microphones on mute. So Tariq, your turn to give your perspectives following that. Do you agree with Anas?
Thank you very much, Chris, for inviting me. But unfortunately, I seem to be having some technical difficulties. My camera is not working, but I hope you can still hear me okay. Hello?
We can hear you fine.
Yeah, all right. I mean, overall, I'm going to largely agree with Enes in terms of the lack of optimism, at least. It's just not a very promising scenario right now. And although to try and avoid repeating a lot of what Enes has said, you know, in his brilliant breakdown of the current situation, I'll try a different approach to this question of what are the prospects for a political settlement, and you know, see if we can uncover anything new with a more direct approach at it. You know, the past few weeks have potentially created an opportunity, which if we capitalize upon it, we could end up with a political settlement. But I think that everything that's come before it and everything that Enes has just put forward now, unfortunately suggests that we're not in a great position to capitalize upon it. You know, there are a lot of structural flaws, for want of a better term, with the framing of the process as it stands, which Enes has done quite well to break down, as well as the international and the local dynamics that makes the likelihood of a political settlement quite slim right now. In order for a political settlement to take hold, I mean, we really need three things. You need constituents that are willing to engage. You need a framing that reflects the desires and mitigates the fears of those same constituents. And you need an arbiter, somebody who can either leverage people into the process or give them guarantees on the integrity of the process. And right now in Libya, we don't have any of these things. What we do have is a war. And it's a war that has been escalating in a truly devastating fashion for the past year now, or just over a year. And what breaks the heart the most about this whole situation is just how utterly unnecessary the whole war was. There was a political process in place. It had its flaws. And Haftar's international backers had actually done quite well to skew it in his favor. But despite all of that, as Enes said, on the day that the UN Secretary General was in Tripoli to see this process over the line, he decided to attack. It was supposed to be a blitzkrieg. It was a blitzkrieg that failed miserably. And like a bad gambler, he keeps doubling down. He keeps escalating, thinking that just one more push will get him there. And every fresh escalation actually, ironically, only takes him away further from his goal of trying to rule the country, because it just fractures the country, the society, and the infrastructure more and more. And he's enabled in doing all of this by the UAE, who are playing, kind of the part of the loan shark in this really tortured analogy I'm now putting together, whereby they keep pushing Haftar to keep going. They give him the arms, the money, the mercenaries, the air force that he needs, in the hopes that eventually it will all pay off. And there is a complete lack of interest in anything from their side but seeing their client take control. And this is exemplified in the aftermath of the Berlin conference in January, where they signed up to this beautiful text with this lovely language on the importance of the arms embargo and enforcing the arms embargo, and then reportedly took less than 24 hours to violate that same agreement that they had just signed up to. And, there are some great accounts on Twitter and elsewhere in the social media space, notably somebody called Gerjon, just to attribute things correctly, who track these flights and publish them in real time. And they've recorded somewhere around 150 air freights, in the 2 months since the conference took place, delivering artillery, delivering weapons, delivering armored vehicles. So, what we have overall is a zero-sum framing, both by Haftar and by the internationals behind him. And it's enforced on the situation by the protagonists of this conflict. And, I'm focusing on Haftar and the UAE in this opening part, not because I'm trying to pick on them or because I'm trying to gloss over the sins of any of the myriad groups in Western Libya, or the GNA, but just because they are the protagonists. They are the ones who are making this a zero-sum conflict. And so it's only natural that when trying to describe why a settlement might not work, we have to focus on them. And unfortunately, if we take a step back from that immediate scene, surrounding this deeply dysfunctional environment in Libya is an international dynamic that's defined mainly by the subversive mendacity of a few and the apathy of basically everybody else. And it's created a lawless situation, which I'm sure Elham will talk about in more detail, where impunity is just frankly rampant. This is down to the international level, as we discussed with the violations of the arms embargo, but also down to the local level, where you have a Libyan commander who films himself doing ISIS-style executions, post them on YouTube. And when an ICC indictment comes down, the ICC are simply told that, we trust his commanding officers and we trust Haftar to investigate the situation and prosecute him. This has created a situation which is not only deadly for Libyans, and that fuels the war to go on, but even UN peacekeeping attempts are consistently undermined. UN staff themselves have been killed in Libya. They're intimidated on a regular basis, and nobody sticks up for them. And this is why we can have these, solemn treaties that are signed with a complete lack of good faith, because people know that, or states know, that their violations are never going to be publicized, let alone punished. And, a situation like that, this kind of Wild West scenario, in a country that's as strategically placed and resource rich as Libya, is one that just invites opportunism. Russia, which has been making headlines for the last 6 months, could very clearly see how the UAE has gotten away with significantly worse than murder. And so it made its own play. and has arguably become the key military edge for Haftar on the ground. It's on the ground as they entrench themselves. And it's also why Turkey, and to be fair to the Turks, they were the only ones who kind of answered the Tripoli government's request to help defend them and prevent this Aleppo-style disaster and multi-year urban conflict taking place on the shores of the Mediterranean. But still, it's why they were able to get involved and why they're quickly becoming the protagonists themselves. And Turkey are not, they're not being altruists in Libya. They've leveraged Libya in the situation that was taking place to advance their own claims to the Eastern Mediterranean gas, which is, a separate region which is destabilizing in a scary way in its own right. But it underlines this notion I'm trying to put forward that a lawless environment in such a geostrategic place as Libya creates a devolving situation that destabilizes in ways that are difficult to predict and which ultimately affect far more than just Libyan interests. But with every fresh iteration of this destabilization, all of these different problems which are now melded together become far more difficult to solve. And it's the long-held apathy of Europe and the West and anybody who's not directly involved with military actors on the ground, which has allowed what was once a flawed and problematic transition back in 2013 to turn into this catastrophic proxy war that we have today. And it's provided the space for Russia to entrench very close to European shores, European gas lines and NATO bases, and it's allowed Turkey to make the plays that they have, which should force or should lead Europe and the West to start, reflecting on the decisions that they've made thus far. And, I agree with Enes that the Turks are looking for a deal here, but, there is a general absence of credibility because of this long-standing apathy and because no moves based on the various principles of the situation, whether it's enforcing arms embargoes or it's punishing human rights violations, have ever been advanced. And so this complete absence of anyone with either the political will or the political weight to mediate a deal suggests that even if Turkey do keep pushing and render Haftar's offensive impotent, we're more likely to fall into a frozen war than any other scenario. And the last component of the 3 points I started off with is the framework. And as the local Libyan edge of the Berlin conference, we had this notion that, once again, Enes just brought up, that there would be military to military talks and then there would be political talks. And these very quickly just didn't come to anything, which I think vindicated the sense of cynicism and fatalism that's spread through so much of the Libyan community with regards to the UN process these days. And this is because, on the military side, to be frank, Haftar is not somebody you can negotiate with. And that's simply because he has no interest in a settlement. And once again, this is not me picking on him, but it's just relaying what he himself has made clear many times, in Arabic, English, and even in French publications. And on the political side is a whole different problem, because you have this menagerie of politicians who exemplify the very worst stereotypes of politicians. And they've been in a process for roughly 5 years now, where they maintain positions of authority, an ability to build local standing and patronage networks of their own, and a whole slew of opportunities for self-enrichment. And this is despite them having no real political constituency or, governance potential or political agenda to advance of their own. So they have every incentive to maintain a process, the process that's going on in Geneva, but they have absolutely no incentive to finish the process, which is why these two different sides, the High Council of State in Tripoli and the House of Representatives in Tobruk, will, sit on opposing sides of the table and argue in the negotiating room during the day. And then in the small hours of the night, they'll meet up and decide how to keep the argument going and how to keep the split going. I'll try and just make one last point and combat this kind of air of pessimism which is falling over this talk, and make a quick call of optimism, or why there might actually be some opportunity to advance things towards a political settlement. Over the past few weeks, as Enes said, some offensives have been made, and I think the standout lesson of that is that Turkey has made it abundantly clear that Haftar will not conquer Tripoli. and that they can match whatever Haftar, the UAE, or others wish to throw at them. And this doesn't mean that the UAE won't retaliate now. And I think that we can expect a dramatic escalation to be upcoming. But it means that this air of inevitability for Haftar's project, that I think has underscored a lot of the apathy towards the situation from various international actors, you know, who will kind of resignedly look at the situation and say, yeah, it's not great, but we've seen this all before in the Arab world, you know, the general against the people, and the general usually wins. So we don't want to get on the wrong side of a future process, as we have done in Syria, for example. But I think that air of inevitability should be considered completely dissipated now. I mean, what we do have are two options. Either we can wait for this escalation, which will be matched and more escalations will come, or we can see what's happening today as an opportunity. You know, a very brief moment of stalemate that we can use to come in hard for a ceasefire. You know, no preconditions, no arms embargo, no more arms embargo violations, just the absolute cessation of fighting, which requires political will, political unity, at least amongst the European states and the USA, but it's not entirely impossible. You know, there are accountability options for those who violate the arms embargo and for Libyan belligerents on the ground. And, you know, alongside a general ceasefire, is just to simply stop kowtowing to Haftar. You know, if we have a ceasefire in place, all the power that Haftar has is suddenly gone. And, you know, we can recognize that there is an opportunity alongside any cessation of fighting to push a process that moves beyond the elite level and moves along and moves beyond either this Haftar versus the rest paradigm or this eternal political process that I previously talked about. And this involves, you know, pushing the UN to facilitate local mediation between the actual communities on the ground who are fighting one another. And that would only make a general ceasefire more resilient and could also push a process that is founded on Libya's decentralized realities instead of just the elite political scene. And the tenets which the UN themselves once tried to push forward under this national conference process before they were so, you know, rudely interrupted by Haftar and his international backers. If we can do all that, which is to find the political will for a ceasefire, to punish any arms embargo violators, and to push a political process that starts with reconciliation between local groups who are fighting and builds from the ground up and from the grassroots level, then we might be able to snatch a political settlement from the jaws of this kind of frozen war that is staring very ominously at us. I'll leave it from there. Thank you.
Tarek, thank you very much for that. And that was a lovely follow-on from what Anas had said. Very much appreciated. So we now move on to our third and final speaker, Elham. Thank you very much for joining us. How do you see things, particularly from a justice, human rights perspective?
I had initially asked to go third, so I could get ideas of what I should talk about, but now I feel thoroughly depressed that I need to just regather my thoughts. But it's great to be in a room with so many people in this time of isolation. So thank you for your company. And it's also great to be on a sort of all Libyan panel, which is not always the case to look at these questions. I think I'll start actually by picking up on one of the questions that were asked in the chat, is, you know, about the question of the motivation or why people lost interest, traditionally interested countries. I think one of the fundamental problems we've seen with the approach to Libya throughout the last few years is that it is approached from one of two prisms, either through the prism of counterterrorism or through the prism of migration. What both of those have in common is that they dehumanize the conflict and they militarize solutions. And I think that's what we've seen throughout the reactions from the international community to the Libyan scenario. It very rarely or at all takes into account the actual situation on the ground and the needs of the people on the ground or the rights of the people on the ground. And we've seen that in the political process. The topic for this topic was the prospect for a political process or a political solution in Libya. And I think, if I may, the question in itself is always problematic to me because it presumes that a solution for a situation like Libya is a political solution. And I think that is not necessarily the correct one. And that's not me advocating for a military solution. It's me advocating for a solution that's based very much on the basis of looking at re-enshrining the rule of law and looking at questions of accountability and making any process that we look at fundamentally anchored in those principles. And I think that's a flaw. We've seen the UN, the UNZMIL process that was started by Ghassan Salama. It had those, the very clear 3 tracks: the political, the economic, and the security. The understanding or the hope of us in the rights community was that underpinning those 3 would be the concept of human rights, and that would be mainstreamed to the 3 tracks. But actually what we've seen is that that concept and those principles were sidelined. And the way we see that is when we look at the security track and we talk to people on the security track on questions like vetting of those who are involved, or looking at people's violations, or making accountability for violations that were committed by security actors. It is always sequenced in the response. And in the sense that it's looked at as saying, well, we need to deal with getting the people to the table first and getting a political agreement first, or a settlement or a security settlement first, then we'll look at accountability. And I think that problem is boringly predictable in the sense that by the time you've done that, it's too late to look at accountability because you've already sacrificed it. A lot has been said about the Berlin process and the words in the Berlin process, which are all great. The problem with that, again, is although we had 6 baskets and one of them was looking at accountability and human rights, there wasn't really a mechanism that was clear as to how that would be operationalized. And so again, it becomes relegated. So where does that leave us? When we've talked endlessly about the political will, and there's obviously none to pursue this. And what mechanisms or what opportunities have we got for accountability or justice in a situation like that? I think we need to look at it effectively in 3 ways. One is looking at actually the tools we have, because we have the tools we need. And there's this real sense of the narrative when you talk to politicians or states involved in Libya is this idea of designing or providing more tools. So the solution is always, oh, we need another resolution on Libya, or we need to have another process on Libya. Whereas actually there's quite a lot of very strong tools. We have a very committed and strong panel of experts at the UN level that has produced phenomenally detailed reports that don't go or lead to anything. And we have a sanctions committee that is paralyzed by the way it's set up and its structure, and therefore doesn't really implement sanctions on anyone until the time that they become totally irrelevant to the conflict. But we also have states who don't take the responsibility of sanctions. And one point I would want to make and to kind of make sure people take away with them is that the sanctions might be issued at the UN level, but the obligation to implement sanctions is at the national level of each country that's a member of the UN. And so the failure of sanctions, or the failure of applying sanctions, does not just sit with the Security Council, which is what people like to say, including states that you talk to or I talk to in my advocacy. It very much sits with every single member state who hasn't used its own domestic mechanisms to pursue those sanctions. And so every one of those countries is breaching their international obligations as UN members. And I think we should remember that when we have people washing their hands clean of not being able to do anything because the Security Council is in deadlock or the like. The other thing we need to think about is, so we have the sanctions, we have a panel of experts that tells us who should, in quite clear terms of who we should be considering for sanctions, and then the process halts. We also have people who are above the law and above sanctions in Libya, and that's not necessarily talking just at the Libyan actors, but at the international actors. I have been in room after room where it's been made abundantly clear to me that there are untouchable countries involved in the Libyan conflict. Key among them is the United Arab Emirates, just because, in the big scheme of things, they're a bigger player than Libya. And if you're going to make a decision, actually, it's okay to sacrifice Libya for the sake of the investments and the deals that the UAE can throw at a country. And that's the kind of realpolitik of this, which then prevents countries from using their domestic mechanisms to go after violators to enforce the sanctions. The other thing we've seen is active shielding of people. So, the other tool that we lawyers like to talk about a lot is universal jurisdiction and the ability to pursue people in third countries for grave crimes, including torture and other war crimes. And what we have seen there is when we've approached prosecutors or the like in countries that have very strong universal jurisdiction mandates, will say to us, look, you know, we can't pursue Haftar when he comes to visit us for this conference or that conference, because actually he'll have immunity granted to him by the state, political immunity for the purposes of the mission, or mission immunity for those purposes. And so even if you stop relying on the states to do their job of enforcing sanctions, and you defer to civil society to do their bit by pursuing things through individual cases through universal jurisdiction, you then have a block by the states to pursue the individuals that are the most responsible and the ones which you would have the strongest case against. And so that leaves you in a situation where actually not only are you undermining the kind of structure of international law, but you're also creating a situation where it is very difficult to talk about a constitutional process or a legal process in Libya that comes out with strong rule of law elements, because actually the message that's been sent very clearly by the international community is that actually the rule of law is irrelevant in Libya. In the most sort of benign ways, like recognizing the GNA when it's not legally constituted as the correct interlocutor, to the most kind of malign of ways of utterly breaching international arms embargoes. And I think that messaging, when you're then talking about state building or transitional justice and the longer term effects of dealing with the past, is that you're really setting quite dangerous precedents where rule of law and accountability and justice are just irrelevant for the building of the state. And that's where my concerns sit, is, you know, what seeds are we putting for the longer term prospects of state building in Libya, in addition to dealing with the current conflict. And I think the other thing we've seen is you know, the point that Tariq has made is, with every single month that passes, the impunity is astounding. You know, there is not even the kind of question of covering up your work or trying to be a bit neater about your violations. It's very blatant. Everyone is aware of it. Everyone talks about it, and it's on multiple levels. So you have the conflict-related matters, which were discussed heavily by Anas and Tariq, but then there's also the kind of day-to-day human rights which people forget in this conflict that are being violated heavily in Libya. You know, one of the things for example, someone asked a question about COVID and the implications of COVID. So the GNA comes up with a very half-baked policy on this, like most countries, I guess, to say that, okay, the advice is that you should stay at home and we're going to have a curfew, etc. Whilst at the same time, people are being shelled in their homes, because you know, there's been an escalation in targeting of residential areas in Tripoli. And it's very difficult to tell someone in that situation, when the real danger is of a rocket falling on their homes, not to leave their homes and to try and find shelter elsewhere. And so we've continued to see an increase of people displaced in Tripoli, despite the fact of the COVID advice and despite everything else. We also see obviously the targeting, like Anas mentioned, very specific targeting of medical facilities, which are needed in a time like this, and also in a country where, frankly, the medical infrastructure is so destroyed by the conflict and it was already weak beforehand, that the further targeting now in this environment is just creating a catastrophe that no one is really addressing or looking at properly. But we've also seen other things that have happened. You know, the curtailment of freedom of expression in Libya has been very systematic and you know, extreme in the east with a very police state approach, but also in the west we've seen you know, decrees passed by the GNA as well as by the parliament in the east that very much restrict people's freedom of expression. We've seen a lot of curbing on civil society, a lot of restrictions on civil society's work. And all these things are not incidental. They're very much at the core of the strategy of trying to maintain or trying to contain the Libyan story within Libya, and not let it get out to, you know, for the narrative to change outside Libya. So I think we spend a lot of time in these meetings discussing legitimately, you know, looking at the impact of the conflict on the situation, but actually the conflict has exacerbated so much human rights. And one of the things that links the two so depressingly is, you know, we've seen even medical professionals who have come out and expressed their concerns about the infrastructure and how its ability to cope with in a situation like COVID, ending up being detained in the east because they're deemed to be questioning the authority of the LNA and also, being accused of being traitors in that time. So I think there's a problem there that we need to address on multiple levels. How do we address it? Unfortunately, the domestic legal structure is like everything else in Libya at the moment, has been damaged significantly, but also there's a lot of obviously risk in trying to bring any kind of accountability measures within the country. And so what we're left with again is the catch-22 of going to the international community for accountability measures. And there we've seen again that there is very little that can be done because of the restrictions on pursuing things like universal jurisdiction or sanctions or UN mechanisms. I've talked about this several times, but the UNSMIL structure as it stands today is really not conducive to promoting or prioritizing issues and questions of human rights. The fact that the work of the political process is effectively done by the same people who are also meant to be seeking accountability and documenting lends itself to the sequencing conversation. And we've also seen in the last year that actually the role of the human rights director has been demoted in UNSMIL in the midst of all this. And so it speaks clearly to the priorities of UNSMIL at this time. And, we talked about the Geneva process, and I was there for the Geneva process, and I was the only lawyer in the room at the time. And it's shocking how little that conversation about accountability and conditionality in the political process happened. So I think what we need to think about really quite strongly is actually calling on, what the international actors should be doing in terms of their obligations. We're not asking for favors, but they are obliged as UN member states to implement UN resolutions individually in their own capacity as a country, not collectively only as the UN. And every single member state is failing on that front because they're not putting the sanctions in place, they're not enforcing sanctions, they're not pursuing those who are breaching those embargoes and the like. So I think that, there is work to be done, and there's work that can be done on that front, instead of people feeling the kind of comfort in blaming it all at the UN and the Security Council. I don't want to take more time because I see lots of questions popping up, and I really want this to be a conversation because there are so many knowledgeable people in this room. So I would, I'll hand over to Chris to see where we go from here.
Thank you very much, Elham. That was fantastic, and it is sobering. And I think you're quite right to point out the way in which justice and human rights issues have been sidelined for so long during the whole Libya crisis. And another thing I'd also, I think is very important, and we're very delighted that we have 3 Libyan speakers today. I think that does matter. And it matters also in other conflicts on Syria and Yemen, that you get people from the countries concerned to speak about what goes on as well. So now we have a number of questions. The first question I had was from Karen Dabrowska, but I don't think Karen is with us. If not, then can we go to Fariel Al-Ayab? Fariel, I know you were with us. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks, Chris. So thanks so much to obviously the speakers. A lot of the points that I wanted to actually touch on have already been discussed. I'm a huge fan of Elham. I've followed you for such a long time. I think the work that you do is phenomenal. Above all that, as a Libyan myself, I couldn't be prouder. One of the questions that I had was, are the political bodies from the Parliament, the High Council of State, the Government of National Accord, able to absorb the sheer scale of political failure that brought Libya to this war? And are the same bodies able to contain the damage as well as politically create a civilian state government whilst complying with the law?
Thank you very much. Which of our speakers would like to take that one? If I could urge them to be reasonably succinct in their response.
I'll happily jump in if nobody else wants to. And not to be a party pooper, but I think frankly that they are completely unable to. I mean, not only do they lack the will, I think they've demonstrated over the last 4 years that they don't have any will in trying to advance the level of governance in the country, but they lack the ability to cooperate with one another and to reasonably kind of, take on this huge demand of trying to rebuild a civilian state to move away from this kind of dysfunctional Jamahiriya model, which actually still does employ more than 80% of the population, and then to rebuild a state from scratch alongside it. But I think what the GNA can do, if they are helped sufficiently, is to stabilize the ground and to pave the way for a transition which might be able to be better tailored to handling these problems.
I'll quickly jump onto the end of that question. So I think it's a great one. And I would say, if we remember when they arrived into Tripoli in, I believe it was March 2016, since that day, or since that time rather, they have been completely pulled away from what their day job was. Their day job is to govern Tripoli, to extend the governance of the GNA across east, west, and south. And they failed to do so because the political urgency set and mandated by UNSMIL, set and mandated particularly by the French and the Italians and the Emiratis, to continue to go to Abu Dhabi 1, Abu Dhabi 2, Paris, Palermo 1, Palermo 2, or Paris 2 rather, Palermo 1. It's a joke. They would never, their job is to govern and to be able to work and legislate, or rather to govern the lives of Libyans, to spend that money in improving the socio-economic service delivery that has failed since before the revolution. And they had an adequate budget to do so, and they could have figured out the problems they had with the central bank governor. But the priorities have been set by outside parties. The priorities that, as I said beforehand, when they said that the UN-backed government is the plan A, there is no plan B. And then we found out that plan B that wasn't even there was to continue negotiations endlessly. So this crisis has been kind of perpetuated by outside forces. And then when we got to 2019 and April 4th, it was, well, the UN-backed government is not doing its job. I agree with Tariq that I think the scale of the task ahead of them is too much. And I'm not even sure whether or not it was designed, given that there's 8 deputy prime ministers, and the scale of what was intended to do in the configuration and assembly of the presidential council from within the GNA, the decision-making process and bodies that came after it. I don't think they were designed in order to do much of a job. I think, and very cynically, I think they were a stopgap for a process that they knew would continue within weeks, because it didn't take them very long to begin to decide that actually they were going to let a process that would be led by Haftar's backers outside, they were going to allow it and give it ceremony and give it legitimacy through the UN. So I think there's been a real danger in assuming that the UN arrived at this failure on its own. It wasn't helped by its own friends.
Thank you, Anas and Tariq. Now, we have actually had a lot of questions about UNSMIL, so perhaps we'll tackle those. Michael Cousins was the first one to ask. Michael, are you with us? No? Well, Michael,
sorry.
Can you hear me? Yep. You're
muted. Yeah, the question I asked was about the usefulness, the value of UNSMIL, or is it indeed an impediment, as some people have said? And the reason I asked the question is, going through my mind, is the notion that UNSMIL, being part of the UN, has been almost institutionally incapable of addressing the Libyan problems because it's coming with a standard Westerner-centric democratic model, pushing for elections for parliament and the presidency, of which we've had elections for parliament twice already. But believing that once we have that, basically believing that things should be fine. The problem I have seen with UNSMIL is that it hasn't really gone for Libyan solutions to Libyan problems. It's been trying to impose this idea that it's tried to bring about elsewhere in many other problems in the world. Since UN was created, it has not succeeded in most political problems. It's extremely valuable in humanitarian issues, but in the case, and it's extremely valuable in humanitarian issues, in dealing with humanitarian issues in Libya. But politically, it's constantly, up until I suppose quite recently, looked at creating a united government as opposed to a united state, and hoping that that's going to work. And part of the problem now has become it's seen as partisan, supporting one side as opposed to another. And I just wonder whether or not there has to be some radical rethinking about the role of UNSMIL and how it addresses the situation in Libya.
Thank you. Who would like to take on UNSMIL? Which of our speakers? Anybody want to volunteer? Well, I shall. Tarek, do you want to say something on UNSMIL?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. And you know, in your discussion around it, you kind of echoed what I was saying before about the lack of credibility that's been generated over the years, which is a problem today if they would like to be a mediator. But you know, to be crude about it, UNSMIL is a tool, and its effectiveness depends on how willing other countries are to use it, or the manner in which they wield that tool. And to be frank, we've not really been able to see an unrestrained SRSG approach the topic as he would like to. I mean, even Ghassan Salame, who, if we would like to be forgiving to him, tried to push for a Libyan solution and an inclusive bottom-up solution. He was consistently undermined almost from day one by countries that wanted to see, you know, a bilateral process between Haftar and Sarraj that Enes has documented in great detail now, that would see Haftar eventually have a power sharing role. And I think as well in that discussion which you gave, you've relayed a lot of the discussions that were going on within some of the main countries who are operating on Libya, which is how to resolve the problem. Do you go for what's been kind of laughed off now, or been always, you know, cynically told to be a Libyan-led process and solution, or do you try to push for an elite bargain, as it were? So yeah, just to wrap it up, I think UNSMIL, the notion of the UN as this independent third party, is theoretically extremely valuable, especially in such a highly contested arena as Libya. But the way it's been used so far has not been ideal, to say the least.
Thank you, Tarek. If the other two speakers want to say something when we wrap up, I'll give everybody a chance to do that, just so we can bring in some of the other questions right now. We have a question from Ahmed Shabani. Ahmed, are you with us? No?
Yes.
Hi, Ahmed. You had a question.
Yes. Good afternoon. What are the prospects of partitioning Libya?
Okay, nice, short and sweet. Anas, do you think there are any chances that partition would be an option, desirable or otherwise?
I think you could have what already looks like a de facto partition. Very, very, I think, honestly, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think in terms of getting it internationally recognized and self-determination, you know, get to the back of the queue, basically. I don't think that Cyrenaica or Tripolitania or Fezzan have any distinct bodies that or groups of individuals that are pushed for this. I would say that the LNA is predominantly made up in Eastern Libya of federalists that, you know, have never really given an articulate vision of federalism and just want to acquire control of the oil, and would even, you know, happily kind of fixate themselves on separating the country in two if they had to. And I think in that sense, I think you could get groups that will spoil, groups that will separate, groups that will create their own. I mean, in November 2013, I believe, it was Ibrahim Jadran that created the Cyrenaican Political Bureau. It was late 2013, I believe, after blockading the oil. So we've already had one attempt at doing this. We've had attempts at selling the oil, we've had attempts at separating the central bank. Those things will continue, but would we have something in the time or era of, you know, Basque separatists, Kurdish separatists, or, you know, those groups globally that are looking for self-determination? Could we have a separate state? I don't think so. I don't think that would be the case. But I think probably, you know, given there's been a question around the Constitutional Committee, I don't see any progress being made on that. And I think there could be a time whereby we go to a very, very strong form of decentralization to the point where it almost looks like each of these different regions are autonomous, possibly. Then you have the major question of oil and how that's going to be divvied up. And I think you just create a huge, you open Pandora's box by doing so.
Thank you very much. Now we've got a question for Elham from Nuha Abdul Dahab, sorry, Abu Al Dahab. Nuha, are you with us? No. Okay. Then we'll move on.
Is she just muted, perhaps?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Might have. is, well, another one for you, I think, Elham, from Jonas Gaith. Jonas, are you with us? He's asking anyhow about whether a commission, yeah, Jonas, hi.
Yes, hi, Jonas, and thanks for the presentation. No, I think I put two questions in there actually. One was linked to the arms embargo and the new Iranian operation and whether this is anything there. And then the question on the and let me maybe double it and I understand everything that has been said about UNSMIL, about the Berlin process, and about everything. But still, in the current context where we stand. So on the one hand, Commission of Inquiry, there was a resolution put forward shortly before the Human Rights Council actually closed. But then I always have the question on the role of the Libyan authorities behind. So maybe I guess that's for Elham. What is your assessment on the draft that was there, etc. And then in the context of the Berlin process, when you think about the basket on accountability, human rights, IHL, and what would be your advice on countries to make something meaningful about it? Thank you.
Elham.
Sorry, the connection was a little bit weird. I didn't hear the first part of the question. Did you get it, Chris? You're on mute. Sorry, Chris.
Jonas, do you want to quickly repeat the first question?
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, first part of the question, it was more like a general question on the EU mission in the Mediterranean, but then really the two questions on the Commission of Inquiry in the platform and being put forward with the support of the Libyan government, which means actually also the Libyan state, which means the GNA. And then your expectation on and even in the taking all into account from the Berlin process, but your expectation on the basket on accountability, human rights, and IHL in the framework of the Berlin process. Did you get this?
Okay. Yes, thank you. I couldn't have planted better questions, Jonas, so thank you. I think on the Commission of Inquiry, this is something obviously that a lot of human rights organizations have been calling for at least, well, strongly for at least 2.5 years now. And just by way of background for those who aren't in the loop, the Commission of Inquiry is a UN process, but it's an independent investigative mechanism that would have a very specific mandate to look at violations of human rights and international humanitarian law over a specified period. There was traditionally quite a lot of resistance to a commission because it was felt that between the UN panel of experts and UNSMIL and the ICC, there was plenty of mechanisms investigating, and what is the purpose of a further mechanism that would be costly. The argument has always been that those have very different mandates, and that there was so the ICC only looks at very specific crimes and at a very high level with very specific types of perpetrators. UNSMIL, as I mentioned earlier, we think is compromised in its ability to not do the work, because they've done some fantastic work in terms of documentation, but then using that work for something else. The panel of experts, as discussed earlier. So the Commission of Inquiry has been sort of lobbied as a mechanism that would really seek to not only identify the violations, but also the perpetrators with the view to pursuing individual criminal liability. So that's quite a high threshold. It's not just sort of commenting on the situation as a whole. There has been obviously resistance in various camps because one of the other flaws, if you want to think about in the UN process on Libya, is that Libya is considered an item 10 on the UN agenda, which means that anything that's done in Libya is done as a support of Libyan processes. So Libya has to be brought in as a state into the process. Again, it's an issue that human rights organizations have had a problem with for a while, because Libya was shifted very quickly from an item 4 to an item 10. Item 4 gives you much more flexibility as the UN to pursue things like its accountability. Now, anything that happens at the Human Rights Council, including a commission of inquiry, has to really be done with the blessing of Libya, which means that, you know, the GNA is involved in the definition of what the parameters of such an investigation would be. And so, you know, they were pushing for quite a long time to keep the mandate very short. So only looking at things in the last year, really, and only looking at things from the perspective of the LNA's violations. Whereas obviously what we would like to see is a wider mandate and looking at the very least events since 2014, but we would settle for sort of the escalation around 2016. But so that's been a debate. We finally had a resolution draft that was workable, tabled in the last session, but wasn't voted on because they had to suspend the Human Rights Council for COVID related matters. And so that's almost like a hideous situation because we have a resolution now that's in final form and just can be voted on. And so we can't even really use this moment to really try to change the wording of it because it was kind of agreed by the drafters, and now we have to wait till Human Rights Council reconvenes for it to be considered. But it is that would be a prospect for accountability that is useful because it would have, if the commissioners are chosen correctly and they're genuinely independent and have the correct resources, you can have quite a lot of useful information coming out of that then can be used to pressurize the ICC or others to do more work. On my expectations on the basket of the Berlin process, I don't have much expectation from the Berlin process at all, because I think it was well-intentioned to start with, and it was well-structured to start with, and some of the bilaterals that were happening in the lead-up to the conference were really promising. But then the pressure that was created for and almost the reactionary way in which the conference took place made it weak in terms of its outcomes, because it felt to me that it was just a gathering of people as opposed to really a mandate, and it felt like the end of the project. We also haven't really seen any indication of what that basket will look like in real life, the way we would like to see it. We debated this for a while, whether we should be advocating to have a fourth track for accountability in human rights, but then that is very problematic because if you have a fourth track, then you're already exceptionalizing that and you're saying the other three tracks can work very well without this, and it means that you again sequence or you separate out human rights violations and you separate out rule of law, which is very problematic. What we would like to see is what the UN is required to do, which is to mainstream human rights considerations into all political processes. And so again, what I say is super boring because all I say is the UN should be doing what it's required and mandated to do in the Libyan process. None of what I say is groundbreaking or interesting. It's just repetitive, and frankly to myself gets boring after a while. But what we'd like to see is for the UN to do what it's mandated to do, which is mainstream human rights into political processes. Then we might have a chance of seeing genuine accountability coming out of the Berlin process or any other process.
Thank you, Elham. What I'm going to do now is there are 3 questions that I wanted to take, which I'll ask the participants to ask, and then we'll go to our speakers in order for any final comments before we wind up, because I'm conscious we've been about an hour now. Now we have a question from Peter Millett, former British ambassador. Peter, you still there? No, perhaps
Yes, I'm here. Just clicking the right thing. Just a quick question to the participants, given that this is about the political process. I saw a report that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, had mentioned a P5 summit, which would discuss Libya. I don't know whether this is to discuss a replacement for Hassan Salameh or for something wider, but could this breathe some sort of new life into a political process?
Thank you, Peter. And now we also have a question from Ian Martin. Ian, welcome. You're on mute, I think. Hi,
yeah,
Ian.
hi. I wonder if anyone can identify any vulnerability of the UAE to pressure regarding its role in Libya. I was asked at the FCO recently what the UK should do to support UNSMIL, and I said call out the UAE and the UN Security Council. Turkey has been explicitly criticised by name in the UN Security Council. I don't think the UAE ever has been, certainly not by the UK. The UAE is a candidate for the Security Council for elected membership next year. Is it acceptable that a country is elected when it's so blatantly in violation of UN sanctions? Of course, the answer to that is probably yes, given the behaviour of other members of the Council, but it's a question worth asking.
It certainly is. Thank you very much. And we have one on the African Union from Faith. Faith, are you there?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. So I'm finding it very interesting, number one, on the question of stabilization and the fact that in the absence of a sort of feasible political pathway, the narrative has shifted more to stabilization. But aside from that, we've seen increasingly, so we are all in agreement about the complex web of foreign actors and the kind of effects that they're having. But I'm finding it very interesting that the AU has been marginalized. Some would argue that this is largely self-inflicted because of the way they've been tardy to a lot of the processes. Some would argue that it's a sort of resource incapacity to a large extent and lack of muscle. So it would be interesting to hear what the speakers have on this in terms of the AU and the absence of the Arab Maghreb Union in the African Union.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Faith. So we're now going to, I'm afraid, have to stop the questions. We go back to our speakers for a quick wind up and a chance to answer those three very good questions. Anas, over to you. Thank you for everything.
Thanks, Chris. Once again, thanks again to Caabu for the invitation. Are we wrapping up from here, or shall we just answer these three questions?
If you could answer the three questions very briefly, and any other points you have to wrap up, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think, yeah, to answer Peter's question, I think, you know, if you want to breathe new life, you know, there are various ingredients towards that. I mean, I agree that having some focus internationally and diplomatically on finding a solution is a useful, you know, is a useful ingredient, a vital ingredient. I don't know, given the COVID global pandemic, whether or not they'll have the full attention of those member states and the ability to push things through. I think given that there may be a migration crisis sparked by an escalation of violence in Tripoli, that might provoke certain member states to begin to push for a solution, but without really addressing the deficit, the questions there around an arms embargo violations that have been committed by Haftar and by specifically by the UAE on this question, and that goes beyond this last war. It goes to 2014 and 15, and their military involvement. I think you're going to go around circles, and I think that's really where we pick up from to Ian's point. I couldn't agree more. The UAE in particular is allergic to public scrutiny, and just find it so devastating to their global reputation to be talked about in this way. I think they would like to be thought of as a playground in the Middle East, Disneyland in the Middle East, not thought of as a place that is destroying and turning countries into basket cases. And I think the major problem here is that we don't understand the motivations of the UAE. It wants to kick Libya, you know, kick it back, you know, screaming really almost, and kicking, or turn it back, kicking and screaming to authoritarian rule, and put Humpty Dumpty back together again as it sees it. That's a failed project. I mean, we should remember that Benghazi, you know, fell apart after 5 hours of protests on the 15th and 17th of February 2011, and that this kind of brittle authoritarianism is just not. It's in nobody's, you know, it's not only is it in nobody's interest, but it just cannot be recreated. The conditions don't exist anymore. And it's a failing project. All it's doing is creating more instability and insecurity in North Africa on the edge of the Mediterranean. And that leads me to the final question from Faith about this idea of stability and this idea of, I think the African Union, I think, is also, you know, a body that has a vested interest in creating a long kind of solution and long-term solution for Libya. I don't think it's got its act together personally. I think there are some old, you know, some old problems and some old perspectives really from the loss of Gaddafi and some old bad blood that is in that body. And I think the relationships have been cultivated inside Libya, or the trust as a body have been given again. I think that there's ample room for it, and I think people should pursue that. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure whether or not that will be revised. But to really kind of end my part on this, you know, I think that as we're moving forward and as we look to a future of Libya that could be stable, prosperous, then we cannot talk about those things, whether it's stability and security. We can't talk about those things without the ideas of social justice, without the ideas of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought. and those things are rapidly being eroded. And the vital final ingredient of trust. You need to have a trusting population. You need to have a population that believes in the process going forward. You can't just have an elite process. So you can call for as many Skypes or as many face-to-face meetings in Geneva or in Berlin or in Moscow. But the idea that wars and conflicts are just like a switch. You turn them on and you turn them off again. When you realize that there is a population now in Libya of 7 million people that are being fed a very steady and very toxic diet of misinformation by media, by rival media on both sides, that they're being fed hatred all day long, socio-tribal, ethnic hatred. They're being taught to hate each other, not love each other and coexist. And the ideas of pluralism, which is really what you need at the center of this, that you live and let live, that someone may come into power that you don't like, but it doesn't mean that it needs to be existential. That it doesn't mean that your day will end on that Monday and you'll never go into power, but also for political parties and political groups, that if they're not in power, and that's at the national level, where it comes to Sarraj or Haftar or whoever else governs the country, but also at a local level. If your tribe is not in power in Eastern Libya, or your tribe, is not in power of the local council in Western Libya, then it doesn't mean that it's existential and that you'll be chased, pursued, and killed as a result. That fear that is palpably there is also being provoked and played on by external actors. It's certainly the case with the UAE, that they're playing on these tribal narratives, that they're trying to create tribal platforms, which are really just platforms for elected men to wear different outfits, ajarad, afartu, like a nice old shanna, as they call it in Libya, an old, dark blue hat or a red hat, and just talk about politics without any form of election, any form of accountability, any form of responsibility. So we kind of need to build off on this and begin to really think about a long-term social footprint that we're leaving behind in Libya, that we could even get to a stage one day. I really hope, after Peter's question, about a time where we could actually have an open international community that wants to end the war. But then what about Libyan people? They might not be ready to end the war after you fed them so much hatred over these years. And then we're in another really, really nasty solution. So I would leave it with this and one final thing. Anyone that is working today on Libya, whether it's an international NGO or in a diplomatic or political capacity, think about reconciliation. Because the reality here is that Sarraj does not see himself in the GNA, doesn't see himself as a dictator. He knows that his time will come to an end at some point, appointed or elected. Haftar is a very old man that will most likely die from COVID or die from a related disease to COVID. So he's not going to be around for a much longer time. But really, the real question here is that they're both irrelevant. At this point, particularly Haftar, he is irrelevant to peace and reconciliation. And reconciliation is probably the best way of giving Libya some form of immunity and inoculation from further conflict. And if we were to focus on that, whether or not we have another meeting in Berlin or another meeting in Geneva is not really the matter, but we could really begin by building at the local level and the subnational level a reconciliation process that could immunize people from saying, I'm not going to start a fight with my neighbor or neighboring community. I don't care whether the UAE wants to bomb this place. I want to coexist and I want to move forward. And that's probably Libya's best shot. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anas. Thank you very much. There are a few countries in the region who might question your issue about how long leaders survive. Their durability sometimes seems to defy all natural laws. But anyhow, we now move on to Tarek for his final comments and thoughts. Tarek.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just echo Anas's point quickly at the start of this, because I think it is really important, and it's often criminally neglected. For as much as we focus on the today, whether it's those who would like to see Haftar take power or those who are absorbed with this war, we should be focusing as problem solvers and so on tomorrow and what tomorrow will look like. Because every day that this war goes on, every escalation that happens, it fractures an already atomizing country more and more. And as Enes was saying, it creates these rifts that will be so much more difficult to mend in the future. I mean, even when we move far beyond Sarraj and Haftar, we might well be in a situation whereby local communities and municipalities, however you want to refer to the constituent parts of the country, simply don't have the tools to work together. They've spent so long working in isolation that they never really become the sum of their parts. And that is just a recipe for continuing conflict in many different guises. And so this focus on the local level in terms of the approach now, also on local ceasefires, but also building from there with the political process, with the economic process, trying to figure out how to stitch these constituent parts together in a resilient fashion, I think should be a key priority that is currently neglected. You know, just to tackle two of the questions that came up from Peter and the earlier one from Jonas, I think it was on Operation Irene, I think it's a good segue to wrapping up the international dynamic at play here, and just some final thoughts on it. You know, Peter, you spoke about, you know, whether the P5 can advance a solution. And Jonas, you said whether Operation Irene can effectively enforce the arms embargo. And I'll go back to an earlier point that I was making about UNSMIL. Both of these things are just tools, and it depends entirely on the political will of those who are wielding the tools and what they would like to achieve. I mean, if we break down the P5, yes, every one of those 5 countries are individually interested in Libya, but we have deeply divergent opinions. We have France that for a whole load of reasons would like to see Haftar take control. We have Russia, whose current interests seem to be best served in allowing the war to continue so that they can continue entrenching themselves and eventually push forward their own candidate. And you know, that those two elements themselves will very likely stop any kind of consensus forming at a P5 level. Similarly, with Operation Irene, you have these great tools, you know, satellite monitoring from SatCent, you have aerial monitoring. But if you look at the political process that led to the formation of Irene, you have a few individuals, you know, whether it's the HRVP Borrell or it's the Germans who would very much like the EU to play that enforcement role. But then you have the rest of the member states of the EU who are either solely concerned with the migration issue. I mean, and from what I've heard of the discussions that took place when planning Operation Irene, most of it was, you know, the Austrians trying to put forward whether they would have the unilateral right to pull ships just in case it was creating a pull factor for migrants. And then you have the apathy, which I spoke about, from the rest of the Europeans who frankly have other priorities and don't see Libya as the threat it could become. And so what do you have? You have Greece, who is purely focused on Turkey and trying to create a mission that will antagonize and punish them, and the French, who are happy to let the Greeks lead the rest of the EU in this way. So unless you fix that underlying problem of political will, which involves isolating Libya from other issues, be it this kind of regional battle between Turkey and the UAE, or the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Sahel, and just looking at Libya as a problem in and of itself, a threat profile to the rest of the world in and of itself, and trying to solve it in the best possible way for Libya, rather than in terms of a grand bargain with everybody else, then we'll continue having this very dysfunctional international mechanism, which will probably only exacerbate the situation more and more, and all of the tools that we end up creating, other than the ones that are already there, will continue just being used improperly because different countries are trying to advance their own interests over the local or the general good. And some people call this realpolitik, but considering that nobody is able to secure their own interests and are in fact weakening their own interests because they keep fighting one another, I'm not sure realpolitik is the best term for such a clumsy approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarek. That's absolutely great. And thank you for all your contributions. So we turn now to Elham to do the final wrap up. Elham?
Well, my success for this meeting is that I've actually managed to survive the technology. So I feel like it's been a success. I think I wanted to pick up on a couple of themes that have come up. The concept of reconciliation is one, and the other one is this idea of disenfranchisement of the Libyan people in this process. In my mind, it all comes down to ownership of this process, and I think that's where, with each passing permutation of UNSMIL, the ownership of the Libyan people has been really distant. And I remember, like, even just general conversations we have with people we work with and our partners in our coalition on the ground is very much just questions along the lines of who are these people that are representing us, or how were they selected, or, you know, even the grassroots attempt that was very well intentioned by Ghassan Salama I remember when they were setting up the meetings that were meant to be open to the public, so those could go, go and share, and they could, move people's opinions about what kind of process they wanted. We had members of our coalition who were driving around not able to find the location because the address I remember very distinctly, and one of the times it just said Tripoli, Libya was the address of where this meeting was being held. And so it's kind of very bizarre situation where it's meant to be about accessibility and opening it down, but actually it ends up being by invitation anyway. And as well-intentioned as UNSMIL staff are and are very well-resourced and connected as they are and their colleagues are, it ends up as to who knows who, and that isn't about ownership of the process. And so I think that's where a real deficit has done, and that's where the credibility of UNSMIL has really, really suffered. That it, with every passing time, it feels like the process is distant. And I can give a personal anecdote to that. When I was invited to join the Geneva process, I was really conflicted about whether to attend or not, because I was asking the same question that everyone else legitimately was asking: is who the hell is she, and why is she there? How does she represent us? And so I foolishly went to Twitter to get people's input on what I should be taking with me, because I was trying to exercise some kind of process where I engage and to be very clear that I'm not there to represent myself. And the backlash was extreme. And this isn't a sub story. This is just to say that there's such mistrust in these processes that no matter what intention you go to get people's consent or their buy-in, there is so little trust in the process. And I think that's what's really vital if we're going to talk about a transition, if we're going to talk about reconciliation. The fundamental ingredient that is not there is trust. And I think that will require a lot to build, because that is effectively how Gaddafi ruled, was by removing trust. And so it's about rebuilding that kind of culture. Reconciliation is one of those four-letter words for me, because I think it's used by people to mean very different things. I am for reconciliation in the following definition in my mind. Reconciliation is not a county, and that is the way a lot of political actors will use it in Libya. So as well-intentioned as we are in the international community when we lobby for reconciliation, a lot of it will mean let's get an amnesty on the table, we forget everything, we split up the pie, and hey presto, we're all friends again and we're going to coexist. If we look historically at any country that's attempted that kind of process, the problems continue. And I think a genuine transition requires a genuine reckoning and a genuine process. And I think that is what reconciliation means to me. That will be a long process. That will be a process about ownership. That will be a process about vetting. It is not about bringing the same people that are sitting around the table today to get them to sign an agreement that will reconcile. This is very much about holding the people at the table today to account. And if they're the wrong people, they leave the table. And the reconciliation is about going back to people's genuine grievances, which very little will be about actually splitting the pie. It will be very much about things like the access to healthcare that they're suffering from today, like the power cuts they're suffering from today, the water cuts, those things that are impacting on their quality of life, their inability to express themselves, their inability to take genuine part in the political process and exercise their civil liberties. And I think that's the problem that we have. So the people who are drafting the reconciliation language we're seeing now are not the people who should be leading it, in my opinion. And if we think of the term transitional justice, people sometimes misconstrue that as it's some kind of special form of justice. It's transitional, transient, or whatever. But for me, it's very much that the emphasis in that term is to say that justice is very vital to a transition, and without it, you don't have one. And there's absolutely no lasting peace without accountability. So I'm fine discussing reconciliation, and that should definitely be the way we go forward. And ownership is the way that happens. But it shouldn't be a shortcut for a political process.
Wonderful. I think we can all take on board your point about the lack of trust and the need for what is a genuine reconciliation as part of all of this, and the need for ownership of what goes on in Libya. I think that's absolutely vital. Well, thank you to our three speakers, Anas Gomati, Elham Saudi, and Tariq Magasi. I think that you've done a wonderful job in tackling some complex issues. We've run a little bit over time, so thank everybody for their patience. Huge thank you for everybody who's participated today and for all your questions and comments in the chat. We're very grateful, and I'm glad to see that there is interest in Libya right now, as well as other countries. So it just remains me to remind you that if you wish to join future events, do get in touch, do email us. There are also links to the video will be going up on the website, so have a look there. Stay safe, and we hope to see you at future events. We'll be advertising very shortly. Thank you once again. Goodbye, everyone.